for joining today's webinar, which is entitled School Climate Discipline for Youth in Foster Care, Tips from the Field and Federal Guidance. Before I go any further, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me all right. So if you could just type in a little note in your questions box, let me know if you're having any audio issues. Okay, great. Looks like you can all hear me just fine. This webinar is co-hosted by Education Law Center, Juvenile Law Center, and the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. Before we get started, I want to run through some technical issues. If you're participating by phone today, your line will be muted during the entire webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type those into the questions box that you just used and also appears in your GoToWebinar control panel, which is that long rectangle to the right of your screen. There is a little orange arrow at the top of that rectangle, which you can use to expand or collapse the control panel. We'll try to save some time at the end of the webinar today to answer your questions. Please note that all webinar materials, including the PowerPoint slides and publications that we're referencing, will be sent to you in a follow-up email in a few days. We are recording the entire webinar today, and we will include the link to the recording in the follow-up email. And so now I'm going to turn it over to today's moderators. Catherine Feeley is a Zubrow Fellow at Juvenile Law Center, and Hallam Harper is a staff attorney at Education Law Center.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thank you everyone for joining us on our webinar today. Also, special thanks to those who contributed to this presentation. Some of their names are mentioned in the presentation, but some are not. But we want to let you all know that if you would like to contact any of the, or get more information about any of the points that you hear mentioned today, we will be sharing, we will connect you to those people who we've interviewed to get the information we're sharing. And our contact information will be on the last slide of the presentation.
Today, we are going to discuss why improving school climate for students in foster care is important, what we can do, and how we can implement some of these strategies and suggestions. And this will include examples from the field.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are and why this is important to the Legal Center. So as Chelsea mentioned, I'm Catherine Feeley, and my co-presenter today is Hallam Harper. And we both work at organizations that are part of the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, which is a collaboration of 3 nationally recognized experts in the laws and practices that govern the child welfare, education, and court systems. These 3 organizations are the American Bar Association, Education Law Center, and Juvenile Law Center. For more than a decade, we've worked to create laws, policies, and practices that advance the educational rights of children in foster care. We've also worked with state and local agency staff, the courts, schools, and other advocates to implement these laws and practices on the ground. This webinar is for educators, administrators, and advocates. And it's important because if schools, child welfare advocates make school climate and appropriate discipline a priority, it helps youth in care, but also many vulnerable kids, and thus an entire school.
No student wants to fail, but some students are never given a chance to succeed. Positive school climates can help. Almost every school of students in foster care, they face unique issues and barriers to their education. And these problems are compounded when students in foster care become involved in school discipline systems. Also, federal laws prohibit schools receiving federal funding from discriminating in the administration of student discipline based on race, color, or national origin. The demographics of youth in foster care increase the chances that disproportionate contact of foster youth in school discipline could stem an investigation into possible discriminatory policies. Disciplinary actions for students in foster care are often a consequence of a number of things. They may be disproportionately disciplined for reasons that are outside of their control. First, They're often disciplined because of the stigma attached to being in foster care. For example, there can be a presumption of behavioral or emotional needs, and that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy when these children are either profiled or because they're not expected to achieve as other students. This stigmatization is especially strong for students who are or were in congregate care settings because of a mistaken presumption that this child is to blame for their circumstances or past. Later in this presentation, we're going to discuss that schools must balance the potential benefits of knowing if a student is in foster care with the risk that the stigma can attach negatively and impact how the student is treated at school. Students are often disciplined for the failure of the school to engage the child's caregivers. This occurs often because the school lacks the information to recognize who their education decision maker might be, or does not have the capacity to appoint one even when one is needed. This is one of the reasons that collaboration with the child welfare agency is very important. For example, if a kid's living at home with a sorry, that's a technical question. Sorry. So if a kid's living at home with their parent, they're much more likely to have somebody who's going to come to school with them if there's a discipline issue. And if there's a meeting with the principal, this can help them avoid a much harsher punishment. By contrast, if you have a kid who's in a group home and there's nobody identified or is contacted regularly by the school as their caregiver who's in charge of their education decisions, that student might not have anyone to come advocate for them at such a meeting, and just because of that might get a more harsh and unfair disciplinary consequence. Identifying a legally authorized education decision maker is especially important for students who are eligible or who are thought to be eligible for special education. And this is because special education and the rights under that law are part of a very parent-driven system, and parent advocacy or the advocacy of some other legally authorized education decision maker is critical. A history of abuse or neglect and removal from the home that traumatizes children can also negatively affect a child's school behavior. For example, frequent school and placement changes and missing educational supports can also increase likelihood of a child in care acting out. And finally, this group is disproportionately likely to be a part of another group that is systematically discriminated against. So a little bit of looking at the numbers of kids in the child welfare system. It's about 400,000 kids in care nationwide. About 240,000 of those are school-aged. Of all of the kids in care, 56% are a member of a racial or ethnic minority group, 20% identify as LGBTQ, and of also this whole group of kids in foster care, they are about 3 times more likely to be eligible for special education. Of all these groups, students in foster care are just generally 3 times more likely to be expelled. Schools should avoid harsh disciplinary, oh, that's nothing in, sorry. Didn't advance the slides. Oh, yeah. Oh, you can. There you go. Here, switching with you. Schools should avoid harsh actions for children in foster care because harsh discipline doesn't work for students being disciplined, and it doesn't make schools any safer. There can also be extremely serious unintended consequences. For example, a judge might predicate a child returning home on their behavior at school. This happened to me recently once with a child I was advocating for. He had been in another placement because of truancy, and he was allowed to return home to his grandmother. He returned in the middle of the school year, did not know that the school had changed their rules because nobody told him, and they had a new dress code that said no hats. And so he wore a hat, and he was suspended, an out-of-school suspension for 3 days. Of note, this is actually not the consequence that was in that school's code, so that was also unfair. But the unintended consequence to him was that this was violating a condition of his returning home, and because he wasn't allowed to miss any more school, and he almost got taken away from his family. One thing that I also wanted to point out, which is from my good friend and colleague Nancy Potter, also at the Education Law Center, is that many of our most harshest school discipline policies have come about in the wake of massive school shootings that have been traditionally in upper or middle class schools and done by white males. However, the consequences of those policies and how they are unfairly and discriminately carried out lands most on African American males in lower income schools. Schools need to invest in preventative strategies and research-based alternatives to exclusionary discipline to give teachers the tools they need to improve school climate. Because, as she says, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And finally, another reason not to use exclusionary school discipline policies is because it can be against the law. Federal law prohibits public school districts from discriminating in the administration of student discipline based on race, color, national origin, language, sex, religion, or disability. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Justice have the responsibility for enforcing these laws. These departments investigate complaints about possible discrimination in student discipline.
And as we know, students in care are disproportionately part of these groups that are systematically discriminated against.
Improving school climate helps all students. So having supportive and non-exclusionary approaches to dealing with this disruptive behavior helps young people in school improve their educational outcomes. Peer-reviewed and educational research consistently demonstrates that a positive school climate, feeling safe and supported in an inclusive, fair, and welcoming environment is associated with academic achievement, effective risk prevention efforts, and positive youth development. This type of positive school climate is fostered by a focus on prevention, including strong relationships and supports for at-risk students, the need to develop clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences to address disruptive student behaviors, and the use of data to ensure fairness, equity, continuous improvement, and to avoid unintended consequences. This research also shows that schools can effectively ensure school safety when the school climate is positive and the discipline is non-discriminatory, fair, and consistent. By contrast, exclusionary practices like suspensions and expulsions, as we said, rob students of classroom time and lead to disengagement and dropping out.
Now we're going to hear the stories of a few youth who Juvenile Law Center has worked with. These are youth in care who are telling us a little bit about the importance of a safe, supportive school environment and school discipline that is not exclusionary and overly harsh. So here we have Chris, and Chris tells us that the classroom is the one place where I feel like I belong, or like everyone belongs. The things you want out of life start and finish in the classroom. And this side is especially important because it's telling you that it's reflecting the instability in other parts of Chris's life and the importance of having the classroom be a place where there is this stability and feeling of family. And just as a side note, these quotes are part of a publication that these youth who you'll see focused on today put together on how to succeed in school if you are a youth in foster care and you live in Philadelphia. So here's another quote, and this is from HECTOR, the gentleman you'll see in the red t-shirt here. And he says, "I know when I was in the foster care system, school was a challenge. All of the problems I was having were a distraction. It's important to get help if you need it." And this slide is important because it illustrates that sometimes youth have trouble asking for help in school, especially if they're in the foster care system and they may have issues with trusting the adults around them, or they may have felt stigmatized by the adults around them. And this is, that the idea that youth in care also may need extra support is another one that is highlighted in this slide. So it's important to make sure that youth in care feel like they are able to access the resources and the support that they need so that they can ask for help. And finally, we have Shiara Hill, who was hoping to be with us today but had a bit of an emergency, so she could not be with us today. But Shy is a current youth advocate who's been in the foster care system, and also is currently right now in our Juveniles for Justice program, because in addition to being in the foster care system, she also was involved in the juvenile justice system. And she wants to tell us why she thinks negative school climates and harsh discipline practices affect youth. And in short, she says that there are about 5 reasons why she feels like these consequences are especially detrimental to youth in care. She says that many times youth in care turn to the wrong outlets. For example, if a student is not receiving support from the adults that are supposed to be caring about them, they could act out in class as the class clown, so that therefore they receive attention from other students. She also says that behavior could worsen if these young people are not receiving appropriate discipline where they feel it's fair, and then this worsening behavior could lead to detention, suspensions, and other harsh consequences that eventually further the school-to-prison pipeline, the idea that children who are disciplined in school are more likely to end up in the formal justice system and in prison. She also says that some youth may turn to drugs and alcohol if they feel like that's how they can cope things, again, highlighting the fact that young people in the foster care system may not have other adults or support systems to turn to, so drugs and alcohol are more likely to be or could be more likely an outlet. And also that some youth might give up and just not return to school or drop out. And we know this is the case for youth in care. We know that there are much higher rates of dropping out among youth in care than other even at-risk populations, such as English language learners or students with disabilities more generally. And finally, SHYH highlights that things could become even more serious for youth in care, that youth who've been in foster care may have emotional issues, and if they're not receiving the right services, they could turn to suicide. So these are all points that SHYH made in a conversation with me, and she wished that she could be here today to tell them to you in person, but has given us the permission to share them with you since she cannot be here in person.
A few of you have asked where the other quotes came from with the youth right before SHYH, and those came from a publication called For the Love of Success, and we will send a link around for you after the webinar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we can do to address harsh climates. The federal government has given us some resources to address harsh climates in school and inappropriate school discipline. Back in January 2014, the Departments of Justice and Education issued a guidance package to assist states, districts, and schools in developing and implementing policies and strategies, that improve school climate and comply with federal law. There is a link to that package on your screen, and it's worth mentioning that this package also includes webinars and a number of resources to implement the guidance that we're going to go over in short in the next few slides so that you can see how this guidance can be applied to youth in foster care. So the guidance is broken into 3 main principles that you don't see on your screen, but I'll read them to you now. It's broken into the principles of climate and prevention, fairness and discipline, and collecting data to improve services. And then in the guidance, under each of these principles, there are a number of sub-points that are often overlapping, but they go into what these 3 main principles mean. Right now I'm going to, on the screen, you'll see the main takeaways that go into those 3 main principles. And they are exclusionary discipline should be used only as a last resort. And if students are removed from class, they should receive meaningful instruction and their return to the classroom should be prioritized. You will see another principle that is reduce the number of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests by providing targeted supports and interventions. That these interventions must have a proven track record of success, and we're talking interventions like restorative practices and positive behavioral interventions and support. You'll hear these discussed more throughout the webinar. Another point, another takeaway from the guidance is to provide students with counselors, school psychologists, and school nurses, especially important for children in care. And the last 2 points are to establish clear parameters for school and city police so that they're not involved in routine school discipline matters. And finally, collecting and maintaining disaggregated data on school discipline and reporting it publicly. So the Legal Center on Foster Care and Education has put out some tools which take the guidance and explain how it can be implemented to advocate for children in care. These two resources are an issue brief, which goes into detail about how this guidance can be used to help youth, and then a Q&A which summarizes the issue brief. And I'm going to highlight what's in these issue briefs, but you can find them on fostercareandeducation.org. And as well, when we circulate this PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on those two links that are on your screen that say issue brief and Q&A. All right, so here's the first point that we'd like to make that's important from the guidance, and it is connect students in the child welfare system with support in school. So we like to highlight this particular point because we feel it's especially important for children in foster care.
The guidance notes that a prerequisite of good school climate is a respectful, trusting, and caring relationships in the school. And recommends that schools should have a network of caring adults who can also serve as partners in the discipline process. Part of this is having a cross-systems collaboration to ensure that the help provided by child welfare agencies complements help that's being provided by the school. One solution that can sort of facilitate this is for schools to designate a trained single point of contact or a staff member who can, among other things, identify preventive educational or behavioral health supports to proactively address discipline issues or needs. This person might also serve as a liaison at the time of school transfer to make sure that a student's records and credits transfer with them and that they end up in the appropriate placements. And further, the point of contact can be a resource for communication and collaboration with the child welfare agency, and in that way can help ensure prompt school enrollment and also accurate class assignments. Ensure this person can be that partner, which can also be very helpful to have in the school discipline process, as the guidance recommends. And again, just especially for children in care, it is important for agencies to collaborate and make sure that every child has an engaged education decision maker. This can be a parent, a surrogate parent, or other legally authorized person who can advocate for that child in the school discipline process and make sure that their rights are protected. Youth in care can inadvertently be punished, just as we said, if there's no parent to play this advocacy role. The guidance really underscores that an individualized discipline determination should be made. However, if no parent or other invested individual is available to help clarify what that child's individualized needs are, then the school needs to identify another decision maker with this knowledge of the child's strengths and weaknesses to make sure that they're treated fairly in the discipline process.
And to achieve this support that Hallam mentioned, we need to make sure that our staff and administrators and everyone at school is trained in implementing culturally sensitive and trauma-informed school discipline and school climate. Now, we know that research has shown that traumatized youth, regardless of whether they are in care, can benefit from trauma-informed approaches. So this type of an approach will help an entire school, but especially youth in care. So what do? We need to obviously build staff's capacity to support youth in care. This includes training and feedback on how to respond to misconduct fairly, equitably, and without regard to a student's race, color, or ethnicity. It requires helping school staff understand their implicit or unconscious biases and explaining the harms associated with using or failing to counter stereotypes that particular groups of children, including children in care, experience. And we realize that there is a tension between us saying, you know, it is important to respond without regard to race, color, ethnicity, but then it is also important to respond in a way that takes into consideration a child's unique needs. But we feel like there is a way to obviously harmonize this tension by saying essentially that you're trying to be empathetic and engage in this conversation with yourself about biases that could show themselves unconsciously. Also, school-based police should be trained on these trauma-informed responses that I've mentioned, on adolescent development, on age-appropriate responses, disability concerns, conflict resolution, and de-escalation techniques, as well as the specific challenges and needs of youth in foster care and trauma-informed responses to youth in foster care. As we've stated previously, there should be limits as to when police are used. They should not be used for routine school discipline because, as we know, especially for youth in care, there are a lot of collateral consequences that come about through involving the formal justice system. Also, schools should establish through practice limits on calling police, and those limits should be guided by state law as to when schools need to reach out and to have that formal support. And finally, it is very important for youth in care that schools be vigilant about the special needs of youth educated within congregate care or alternative education programs, because we know that youth in care are also often in these types of programs. The guidance suggests that attendance in the local public school is preferable to separate schooling in alternative school settings, and that the positive disciplinary approaches described in the guidance should apply in alternative settings as well. They also explain in the guidance that on-site programs should offer meaningful instruction and offerings comparable to those in regular schools. And finally, the guidance mentions that attention has to be paid to ensure a true smooth transition back to regular schools. And I think this is an important opportunity to point out that there is a whole separate set of guidance that came out in December on the importance of, or how schools can effectively educate children who are in secure placements, be it juvenile justice system or other alternative secure placements, such as residential treatment facilities. So if you'd like a link to that guidance, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to connect you. That guidance has a lot of really, really important policy and practice recommendations and other resources. And a final point that we'd like to highlight, especially from the guidance but for youth in care, is the importance of collaboration with mental health offices, child welfare agencies, and other stakeholders. And this is to align resources, prevention strategies, and intervention services, and to create and evaluate programs that are being used for youth in care. So the guidance underscores that appropriately designed partnerships, so these are partnerships that consider responsible information sharing and data sharing with local mental health offices, child welfare agencies, and other stakeholders can help schools identify students coping with trauma or emotional issues. It can allow schools to expand interventions offered as part of a school's supports, and it can ensure a continuum of care between schools and community-based mental health providers. We know this is so important in a time when budgets are being cut and these supports are not able to be offered in schools anymore. But in order to make sure these partnerships are appropriate, it's important to develop written agreements or memoranda of understanding that formalize the partnerships. And, Juvenile Law Center and the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education have a lot of resources on how to develop agreements that clarify roles, areas of responsibilities, and procedures, scope of work, and really operationalize how a partnership needs to occur and how these partnerships address discipline and support that complies with applicable laws. And finally, discipline prevention strategies should be evidence-based and data-driven, and we've talked about this before. but it's worth mentioning again that especially for populations that where there is a history of the population being systematically discriminated against, it's important to monitor our reactions, our actions with them, and make sure that all of the programs that we are putting in place are actually having the effect that we have intended them to have. So by separately assessing the progress of youth in the child welfare system as well as other at-risk groups, schools will be better positioned to address the needs of this highly vulnerable group of students and address the needs of other vulnerable students in their population.
So now we're going to move on to the even more interesting and fun part of this presentation, where we get to move from policy overview to actual practice. And we're going to hear some helpful insights and tips and suggestions from youth in foster care, advocates, and administrators at the state, district, and school level.
So here again we have SHYH, and again she would like to be here, but since she's not, I'm going to tell you what she says her recommendations are to improve school climates for youth in care based on her experience as a youth in care who was severely disciplined, put in multiple juvenile justice placements, and eventually excluded from her school and unable to complete her education there, and she was eventually forced to seek her GED outside of the traditional school environment. She said if she had to summarize her recommendations on how to improve school climates, she would make people who are involved with youth, including teachers, aware of youth in care situations. So this goes back to Hallam's point of making sure that you have a team of people who are a support system, or essentially a single point of contact in school. Also, come up with a plan on how to keep the youth feeling safe and supported, SHYH says. She says make sure that their situation is considered when discipline issues arrive, and that rewards reflect the unique needs of youth in care. SHYH also says that it is important to have optional therapy or extracurricular activities just for those youth. Make sure that they have a positive outlet to express themselves. But she says that it's important to balance those optional activities and special activities with making sure the youth does not feel stigmatized or like an outcast. Again, highlighting that tension of recognizing the unique difficulties and strengths that these youth have, but making sure that they also feel included in the rest of the school population.
And now we're going to move on to some advocacy tips. These come from Ashley Fredholt. She's an attorney at the Legal Assistance Foundation in Chicago, and she works with students who are involved in the foster care system on education rights issues. She has a lot of really great suggestions. Some of the first ones are sort of how to mitigate school discipline issues once they arise. And the first one is always request written documentation related to school exclusions. Make sure that any notice for any sort of hearing is in writing and that it includes an explanation for the action being taken. If there's packing the room at meetings, so for a hearing type of setting, bring as many people as you can for the student, because it will show that they have a community and a network of support, and a community is going to care about them. If a meeting related to school discipline is a manifestation determination meeting for a student with a disability, having as many people there who have knowledge of that child can be extremely helpful to figure out whether or not a behavior is related to a disability, or whether or not this child maybe should be evaluated, or someone should have known that they had a disability. In these hearing settings, in a disciplinary setting, explain that child's circumstances to humanize them. And what she really means there is that if you can sort of share that this student may have had it a little bit harder than most, and they might need special support and assistance to benefit from school and to be successful in school. In terms of prevention strategies, one of them is some of them are very basic, particularly for students with disabilities. For the student who's transferring schools, always make sure that that IEP transfers with them and is implemented as it's written. Similarly, making sure that the IEP and any evaluations are up to date, especially the behavior intervention plan. And if something is not up to date, or maybe there isn't a behavior intervention plan, request one, and make sure that you think it's good. And there's always the option of requesting an independent evaluation. And then finally, facilitating interagency communication regarding mental health needs, and particularly with previous evaluations. So when you're advocating for a student, to make sure that you ask if they have seen a therapist outside of the school, or have had an outside evaluation or been hospitalized, the information there can be very useful, even if perhaps there's been an evaluation that's on the medical or mental health side that shouldn't be disclosed to the school in its entirety. With the appropriate consents and releases, it could be redacted and still be extremely useful to provide to particularly a school psychologist or guidance counselor. And in the disability context, even just knowing what assessments that child has had in the past year or so from an outside agency is very important, because those assessments also can sort of invalidate each other if they're done too close together. So having that continuity of information is extremely helpful. So we also have some suggestions from Jenny Valverde. She is an attorney and professor of law, education, and health law at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She has a bunch of red flags to watch out for. These red flags include informal exclusion from school, by which she really suggests enrollment and placement delays that are often faced by children in care. This exclusion from school comes with excessive documentation requirements, things like requiring an IEP before a child can enter school, or requiring that a child must be reevaluated before they can be placed, or even making a kid sit at home or at a group home while the school, quote, is looking for a placement. Those are all legal types of exclusion from school. Not providing comparable services prior to a reevaluation, and is also a type of exclusion. One other issue is counseling out. This is when a school, instead of initiating discipline procedures, particularly with charter schools, might sort of suggest that rather than going through those discipline procedures, that the child move on and go back to maybe a district school and just sort of, oh, we'll let you disenroll and transfer, and we won't put anything on your record. Last, another type of exclusion is suspending a student without calling it a suspension or documenting it as such. So sometimes a school who just doesn't want to address or understand whatever a student is going through that might be displaying certain behaviors will call a parent or caregiver or case manager to pick a child up from school. Ms. Valverde suggests that parents and caregivers should absolutely insist when that happens that a school provide documentation in writing explaining why that child is being sent home before they leave the building.
And in addition to interviewing professionals from the individual advocate level, we also interviewed professionals at the systems level. And then on this slide, you'll see a publication that was put out by people in our stakeholders in Texas. And this was in Texas in 2010. Roughly 100 members of agencies began collaborating to improve education for youth in foster care. And this collaboration consisted of educators, judges, legislators, child welfare agency leaders, advocates, former foster youth, private foundations, and lawyers. And this collaboration was called the Texas Children's Commission Education Committee. And they were funded by a federal court improvement program grant and supported by dedicated staff and technical assistance. And really, this publication that's featured here, the Texas Blueprint, Transforming Education Outcomes for Children and Youth in Foster Care, it included over 100 recommendations and strategies related to the topics that Hallam was mentioning, such as school experience and support and advocacy, school readiness, stability, transitions. And this document was important because it came about as a result of an 18-month collaborative effort among these different players that were mentioned, and it resulted in some really fantastic work that we're going to try to overview a little bit. But I did want to tell you that in March, an article will be coming out summarizing the last 2 years of implementation of this blueprint, and that document will focus on the full scope of the work. And if you'd like access to that document, you can definitely get in touch with us, and we'll put you in touch with those people who have access to the document that will be coming out. But in short, what this collaborative Texas Children's Commission Education Committee did was they put together this blueprint that then was implemented through the Texas Blueprint Implementation Task Force. And to date, 80% of the recommendations in the blueprint have either been realized or are underway. You can find more information about this on a link that's in the notes to our presentation, but some examples of implementations that they've put forth have been these data collections that we've discussed earlier, where they took a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Family and Protective Services and the Texas Education Agency for aggregate data exchange on children in foster care, and that information is exchanged and then will be evaluated by education and child welfare agencies to establish both an initial benchmark for agencies to identify the educational needs of students in foster care, and also to monitor the effectiveness of programs and policies that support children in foster care. Also, a really important thing that the implementation task force did was put together coordinated communications and presentations to stakeholders, such as the CASA Educational Advocacy Toolkit, and letters to kinship caregivers, school administrators, and agencies that really explain how you can support children in care. And then finally, a cross-systems panel. And that was another way that communications were put out to, different stakeholders, such as the Texas Association of School Boards. And the last part of the implementation task force that I'll mention is that they helped with the codification of Federal Fostering Connections Act of 2008. Some of the state law that was changed now makes it mandatory for the state child welfare agency to name a specific education decision maker and file that with school, court, and other parties. Also, courts, attorneys, and guardians ad litem must inquire about the student's educational needs and goals, and the child welfare agency must develop an educational stability plan.
So some suggestions also from our Texas folks is to addressing capacity issues. They suggest that training staff before implementing new policies and practices. For example, you need to provide tools ahead of time so that students can do, so that teachers can do consistent classroom management. They need to know how to properly do that, and to have those skills before rolling out these new policies and initiatives. They also recommend that there are lots of really helpful free online resources. There's one linked on your screen here, the Meadows Center for Preventing Education Risk. It has modules that educators and other agency workers and foster care providers can use to work on improving cross-systems collaboration. For example, how to communicate with each other and learning about each other's perspective to improve that communication. They also developed a manual which explains, it's pictured here, foster care and student success. This manual explains important ways to improve school climate, for example, by using foster care liaisons in each school, and giving trainings to shift away from zero tolerance and toward other models such as positive behavioral supports and building relationships, strengthening wraparound supports in schools, and through care teams. These care teams are support teams on a school campus that include an administrator, social worker, and special education professional. Those are just some examples. So we also have some tips here from a school district administrator. This is from Rachel Holtzman. She is Assistant General Counsel and the Deputy Chief of the Office of Student Rights and Responsibilities at the School District of Philadelphia. And before that, she spent 16 years as a child advocate attorney at the Public Defenders. So she really, really knows a lot about where students in foster care are coming from and to what they need to be successful in school. Some of her recommendations include cultivating a really close relationship with education liaisons who are working, with the foster care agency. In this case, in Philadelphia, some of those liaisons are actually placed directly in schools to facilitate those relationships and to meet the needs of the students. Also, considering student circumstances in school discipline proceedings. We mentioned this a bit earlier about the importance of sort of this individualized approach. We have some examples here that I won't be able to go through all of because we have another speaker in a moment. But just knowing that it really can change a kid's life to be able to have somebody who can advocate for them, to explain to a hearing officer, this student, this school is important, this family home was important, how can we keep her in the same placement and support her needs? Maybe there's some alternative discipline option for this student. Instead of changing schools to an alt ed placement, maybe what the student really needs is to go through some therapy to address their trauma and to have a behavior contract at the school. And then finally, Ms. Holtzman really emphasizes the importance of using school-wide positive behavioral supports and trauma-informed practices to benefit not only all students, but also to remove the incentives to over-identify or unnecessarily identify students as needing special education services. That is a misallocation of resources for the school, and it's unnecessary labeling to the students. Removing these incentives to over-identify kids in foster care with disabilities and focusing on this school-wide interventions is an incredibly effective way to address discipline practices and to improve behavior and outcomes in the whole school and improve the school climate as a whole.
All right. So to our featured speaker today, Karen Baer, former principal at Mackenzie Middle School in Lubbock, Texas. I have a long introduction for her in the notes, but I'm just going to let her talk for the rest of our time together because I think it's important to hear from her generally how important it is to make sure school climates are receptive to children's needs when they're in foster care. All right, to you, Karen.
That's so, yeah. Okay, are y'all ready?
Ma'am.
Okay. I just want to say I appreciate every single thing that's been said to this point. And I also would love for everybody who has been working maybe in the legal system to understand a bit more about what school administrators and teachers are dealing with. It sounds like it should all happen and be easy and no problem, but it's very, very difficult in some schools that are larger. And it's also difficult in rural schools that don't have as many resources. So I'd like to speak to both groups because I have been the administrator in both groups. And so from an elementary perspective, I think that it's super important for everybody on the campus to get involved, not only with those kids, but with all of your kids to create that sense of family and to understand that children have been very, very damaged by adults. The adults have hurt them. And so it's not that they're being rude or disrespectful or that they just don't want to be compliant. They're genuinely, deeply damaged and afraid and possibly have even just been recently removed from their homes, and they're not sleeping well, they're just not themselves. So I think giving them that little bit of time and also understanding that there are some solutions that are not going to cost you anything other than your heart and a little bit of your time can make a tremendous difference. And I can say that with confidence because my elementary school that I worked with as the principal for 6 years, we took care of Children's Home of Lubbock. We also took care of Texas Boys Ranch, and several independent foster homes. That school was performing poorly when I took it, and for the last 3 years of the 6 that I was principal, we were exemplary. And the way that we became exemplary was when we stopped pitying the children who were in foster care and started helping them deliver or to develop the skills that they needed to be very, very successful students and successful in life. And one of the most easy, convenient methods that we used was our breakfast advisory club. And even our secretary, everybody, every adult had about 10 to 12 kids. And those kids were in their little family group, their little breakfast advisory group. And they ate breakfast together. They looked at grades, they looked at attendance, they looked at behavior, and they just were kind of their parent at school. They were the ones that typically had conferences with whoever their caregivers were, and just helped so much with getting to know the details of what that child has experienced and exactly what we could do together and collaboratively to help that child be successful. So that's something that I would love to encourage both at the elementary group, at the elementary level, and also at the middle school level. I think it would work at high school also. I think it works anywhere because those children in foster care just want to blend in. They don't want to stick out. They want to be part of what everybody else is doing. And they'll tell you that if you'll listen to them. They may be behind and they may be embarrassed because they don't know things academically. But again, that can be addressed through small group instruction and through just different tutoring opportunities that you have. Another thing that we've done recently at the middle school level was a 3-day orientation camp, and we did that the first 3 days of schools, and it involved every member of our campus. And I would love to share ideas with anybody who's interested in that. We did some great work using live binders and created some awesome lessons that we did together. And it helped the teachers learn as much as the students. I think it kind of helped us all get on the same page, which is difficult to do at the middle school level. Our enrichment and intervention programs worked so well that at the elementary level, we really got to the point where we didn't need intervention. It was very, very limited. And it's moving that direction at the middle school that I just recently moved away from due to a job change with my husband. Heartbreaking for me because that school is doing some incredible restorative work. We have been doing some restorative practice for the last 1.5 years, and I can tell you that when educators and parents and all the people involved in any kind of a problem with the student sit at the table and start talking about what's bothering them, what the source of the problem, and everyone has an opportunity to speak, you work through things. It's not about an administrator being harsh or making a decision. It's collaborative work that makes sense. And I don't know why we think that's so hard. It's really not. I can tell you that opportunity time is something that was used as, I guess, some people could say that was a disciplinary thing, but I created that. It was a class that we did from 4 to 7 p.m. 2 days a week. I taught the class as the principal, and we worked on things that kids struggle with at school. And you know, that kept them in class. They really didn't want to give up their personal time to come and work with me. And they learned a little bit more quickly, I think. And the funny part is that most of the kids that were involved in opportunity time were not our kids in foster care. So that's really neat to hear and neat to realize that they're not a unique group. They're just like all the other kids, and they have the same needs, the same desires, and they can learn and be so successful. Our nonverbal card system was one system that we used that kept kids from maybe becoming that birthday clown in the classroom that's getting all the attention. It was something that we worked on that orientation camp or during that orientation camp, and I'd love to share that system with anyone who's interested as well. It works extremely well and helps kids self-regulate. That's the whole goal. Also, realizing that getting parents in the building for activities is not just for elementary. It is for all schools at all levels. Kids and parents, or anyone, caregivers, anyone who has any interest in a child, they need to spend time in the school building, and they need to see those children performing in different club events or whatever it is that you have going on. So I think that's a great reminder for middle school and high school parents and teachers to remember that they need to focus on spending time together as much as they do at the elementary level. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking, and there may be people that have questions or maybe something more that they want to know about, or I just wonder how I might be able to help more specifically.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen, and we are almost at our finishing time, but we do want to give people the chance, if they do have questions, to ask them to Karen. And if Karen's available for maybe 10 minutes, the following 10 minutes to answer those questions, that would be great. Are you available, Karen, for the next 10 minutes?
I'm so available.
While we give folks a minute to type their questions into the chat box, we're not going to spend time going through, but we've listed a few resources and things at the end of the PowerPoint slides, which we will send around along with everybody's, including generously Karen's contact information. So if there's any questions that we don't get to today before the end of the presentation, or that you think of later, you can always reach out to us then.
Okay, so one general theme is that people are asking for examples of data-driven discipline and examples of where they can get guidance. Those will all be in the presentation that are mailed to you. Another participant asked,
I'll take this one. Somebody asked about who or what agencies can provide the training necessary to make effective advocates, or to help people advocate for the needs of kids in school. And I think that this can come from a number of places, and depends on who you're actually training to be an advocate for one. But the first is, I would say, legal organizations. Obviously, this will vary depending on where you are, but lots of them do trainings like this on the education rights of kids, particularly kids in foster care, kids with disabilities. Certainly in Pennsylvania, we do at the Education Law Center and the Juvenile Law Center. I know that at the Legal Assistance Foundation in Chicago, that they do trainings for child welfare attorneys, and that is something I think you would reach out to some local organizations. And it depends also on your state. Some states are implementing this from the top down, like Texas at the state level is trying to set up as much information and resources as possible to help people in a variety of capacities be excellent advocates for students in care in school. And in Philadelphia, they sought out additional funding through grants and foundations to provide those types of trainings, so that people could be better advocates in the classroom, too, like for those trauma-informed setting. And as we've just heard from Karen, she's done wonders by using what she's got at the school, and by, I'm sure, Karen, perhaps you can speak more to this directly, but that, through your leadership, not only were you helping your students, but obviously you had to probably help your staff first, and that in that way you trained them to be great advocates for all of your kids.
I think the adult issue is probably the biggest issue, and it's just because they have so much stress trying to make sure that they take care of test scores and covering all of the curriculum that's required, and it's stressful. And so you have to be very proactive. You have to work before any of the learning begins. It's basic Maslow's theory. If their physical and emotional needs are not met, then the cognitive stuff is not going to happen. So we have to really realize that we have to take care of that as a family, work together, and not expect a principal or some attorney or anybody else to be the one that makes all the decisions about what happens with a child. It's a joint effort, and it's hard work, but no one's alone in that. We can help each other, and we can definitely help these children experience success. I have so many examples and can give people so much hope based on my personal experience with these children.
Okay, for Karen, one participant said, would Karen mind responding to follow-up emails on her presentation, specifically around breakfast advisory clubs and the card system?
I'd be delighted.
Okay, great. And in those emails, would you be able to also speak more about the enrichment and intervention programs?
Absolutely.
All right. Or if we have a second, she could also address the enrichment and intervention.
I can tell you that the intervention at the elementary level was very just systemic. Once we got things in place where we had a great three-tiered model, and again, this was something we got from the Meadows Center. They helped us with that with our reading and math programs. Once we had that in place and had everybody on the same page, we could accelerate a child's learning 2 to 3 years in a single year because we had our systems down and we had great resources. And we just watched our children not need the intervention as they got older, which, hallelujah, that's what we're looking for. And then I can also say, from the middle school perspective, that's how I really motivated kids, because I let the teachers select things that they were passionate about. Like we had a knitting class and a Zumba class, and just science, like our forensic science group, a chess club. We just had a 40-minute period in our schedule where the majority of the teachers were working on some type of an enrichment, but we also had those experts who were ready to pull kids who needed to work on their academic weaknesses. And I would say 8th graders, big 8th graders, come up with tears in their eyes and say, "Miss Pear, why did you pull me out of my enrichment class?" And I'd say, "Well, sweetheart, you didn't do well on your assessment." And he'd say, "Well, what do you need me to do?" And I said, "Well, I need you to do well on your assessment and show me what you know." He goes, "Okay, I'll do it." So it's hilarious, but those kids just need people who believe in them and push them and tell them, you can and will do tremendously well at this school.
Karen, I love that. I have one more question for you, and then we'll let you go. And I wanted to end on that. So I just wanted to mention that if for the folks whose questions we didn't get to, please look, particularly for the special education-related questions. We have some great resources on our website, also for the FERPA-related questions. And if you need help, you can email me and Katie to follow up with those. But I do want to ask right now to you, Karen, one last question that I think is that I think is really a good one. How did you begin the mind shift to create a positive school climate, and how did you get teacher buy-in? Also, how did you build the teacher's confidence to be able to interact with students in this way?
Well, I think the buy-in part comes because there's need. You know, teachers are frustrated and they're looking for some solutions. And so when you can model for them and guide them through a restorative conference and show them how that works, I think that people get excited and they tell their friends and they're like, man, this really works. And that people would realize that I had studied a lot, I'd read a lot, I would share things, and then I would actually do it myself. And you know, the teachers were very, very open once they saw that I was willing to dig in and I was willing to try. And sometimes things didn't work that we were trying, and we just have to, you know, get back up and clean ourselves off and try again. And teachers just appreciate the opportunity to learn and to try something different. At both of the campuses that I worked with that had lots of foster care kids, those teachers were very, very desperate for help. And so I think once you got them through it and they start to get some confidence because they see that it works, they just kind of puff their chests out because they realize they're great teachers.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. And this has been really, really helpful, and I just think that you're a very, very inspiring and energizing person to hear, and I'm really glad that we got to share you with everybody on this webinar today. So thank you, Karen, and thank you so much to everyone who helped us gather the information for this, and I hope that the rest of you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and I wish all of you the best for the remainder of this school year.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone.